everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulation. My name is Bethel, and I'll be your host for today. As many of you know, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which means that this month is dedicated to highlighting the struggles and the history and the ambitions of the domestic violence advocacy movement, as well as highlighting survivors and victims. And October is a special time of the year because that is kind of one of the few times where domestic violence is really talked about um, for longer than just a short conversation that you might have with somebody who works in the field or with a survivor or with the victim. And instead, a lot more people are aware of domestic violence issues in this country and beyond because we have a whole entire month dedicated to DV. So, we'll be dedicating this episode to looking more into the history of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, as well as looking into the history of gendered violence. So, in ancient Rome, beating your wife was something that was totally acceptable socially, legally, morally, basically. And it was just kind of something that was expected when somebody got married, was that the wife should be expected to get violently beat, or the husband should expect to have the ability to harm his wife. And this is where we get the version of the rule of thumb. And what this is that it permits that a husband can beat his wife with a rod or switch as long as it's no greater than the girth of his right thumb. And this practice, the rule of thumb, it eventually ended up being heavily linked to English common law and colonial life in the United States later on. So in 1824, Mississippi's Supreme Court allowed husbands to inflict physical violence upon their wives in the case of emergencies. And in their case, emergencies was basically if their wife was doing something that they weren't supposed to do, or if they were doing something that would make the husband look bad. In that case, that's when the husband would be allowed to inflict violence upon their wife. And this was, in some ways, a method to legally allow husbands to protect themselves from the wrongdoings of their wife. And a lot of people say that this kind of paved the way to what we know as gaslighting. And fast forward a little bit to 1871, Alabama was actually the first state to rescind the legal right of men to beat their wives. And just 11 years later, Maryland was the first state to pass a law making wife beating a crime. And in 1875, just a few years after Alabama rescinded the legal right for of men to beat their wives, a woman of the name of Martha McWhirter, she opened up the first domestic violence refuge in Belton, Texas. And so these kind of spaces eventually popped up more and more across the country a little bit later, around the 1970s, 1980s, about a century later. And then in the early 1900s, that's when we first seeing family courts. This suggests that family issues, quote unquote family issues, were better suited for a family court versus a criminal court. And this begins to set the underutilization of criminal justice courts for domestic violence crimes. In 1919, that was when some women, as we know, were finally able to have the right to vote. And this is important because it eventually led way for women to finally have some kind of political power when it came to their own protection and their rights. So during the 60s and 70s, when there was that second wave of feminism, it was during that time that domestic violence really became politicized. And as a result, it kind of combated the narrative that domestic violence was a behind doors issue, something that you should figure it out on your own inside your own house. And it wasn't something that really needed to be brought out to the public or shared. Um, Basically, the there's still very similar sentiments today, but just imagine at that time, if, I mean, as we just mentioned a little bit ago, there were literally legal rights for men to inflict physical harm upon their wives. And so this was a very big deal for women and feminists to finally push back and say, hey, no, this is a really serious issue. And it's not fair that we have to suffer in silence. And so during that time, in the late 1970s, that is when we finally start seeing Take Back the Night marches. And what Take Back the Night marches are, or what Take Back the Night means, it's kind of a way to protest against the violence that women experience. And that can look like different kinds of violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, etc. And this is one of the many examples of women finally. Being able to have a voice and advocate for themselves and for the people that they know that were suffering in silence for so long. And so, about a decade or so later, a little bit more than that, we see the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, and that creates and supports comprehensive, cost effective responses to domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. And it was the 1990s where we finally saw a rise in conversation on intersectionality and having a better idea of what gendered crimes can look like and the social and political structures that uphold them. So, in the last decade or so, we've definitely been able to have a lot more public conversations about domestic violence. And I think the shift towards uh, being a lot more inclusive and having those conversations has also been something that has been extremely prominent in recent years. Although that it did not start just in recent years, there have been people of all marginalized identities that have been having those conversations from the beginning and have often been silenced as well. So it's been really nice to have things like the social media and the internet to be able to see other people's stories, learn about other experiences, and also educate other people. Something that has been really, really successful and prominent in recent years has been the Me Too movement. So the hashtag Me Too movement. And things like that are were only made possible because of those who advocated and marched and suffered before us. And so I think it's really important that we highlight kind of the nuance in what has happened in the past for us to get to the point where there needs to be a domestic violence awareness month. And again, everything that I just shared with you all comes from the Genesis Women's Shelter and Support website, where you can find more information about the history of gendered violence and domestic violence. Now, switching over to the history of Domestic Violence Month, this all comes from Connections for Abused Women and Their Children, so their website. And it starts in March of 1917. The National Woman's Party is formed to fight for the women's right to vote. So, this is something we mentioned a little bit earlier. And like I had mentioned, this was important because it allowed for women to finally have some political power to be able to have some legal protection against domestic violence and all other sorts of violence as well. The National Women's Party's official colors are actually gold, white, and purple. And so these colors were something that offered a more symbolic presence and representation of women's rights, specifically also when it came to violence. And in January of 1978, that was when the United States Commission on Civil Rights held the consultation on battered women, and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which we know as the NCADV, is officially formed. So that summer, July 1978, over 100,000 women marched in Washington, D.C. to advocate for equal rights, and many of them were wearing lavender and purple. And so, obviously, these colors are something we still see today, as you can see behind me in our Sisters House logo, what I'm wearing, with purple representing domestic violence, advocating against domestic violence and for domestic violence victims and survivors. So that was the color that a lot of them marched with. And it also kind of ties back to the National Women's Party and their official colors of white, gold, and purple. So a few years after that march in DC in October of 1981, the NCADV declares a National Day of Unity, and that day was on October 17th. And what their goal was to have an official day where there would be that public awareness of domestic violence in communities and across the nation. And it was then that purple was considered, like officially considered, the official color for domestic violence and for that day. So the Day of Unity quickly becomes a week of unity, and that allowed for more events to happen on the local level and on the national level as well. And some of the things that they did was mourn people who have passed due to domestic violence, highlight people who are experiencing domestic violence, creating connections with organizations that are trying to tackle this issue, and celebrating the resilience of abuse survivors everywhere. It took a few years, but it wasn't until October 1987 that the first month was celebrated. So the first Domestic Violence Awareness Month, as we know it today. What also happened during that month was the first toll-free national domestic violence hotline was finally live, and you can reach that number today by calling 1-800-799-7233. 2 years after that first Domestic Violence Awareness Month was celebrated, in 1989, Congress finally passed a public law that recognized the month of October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month on a federal level. And then a few decades later, in 2010, an individual named Catherine Hudson co founded Wear It Purple Day in support of LGBTQIA youth who were experiencing any kind of struggles in their life and highlighting their resilience. And so, Wear It Purple Day eventually turned into Purple Thursday, which the day of this recording is actually Purple Thursday. And later on in time, domestic violence advocacy organizations eventually adopted Purple Thursday as well to kind of really highlight domestic violence in October. And what Purple Thursday is, if you don't know, is a day where people go out of their way to make sure that they're wearing purple, whether it's like purple socks, purple jewelry, a purple scarf, purple glasses, anything like that, just to help start the conversation going about domestic violence. Um, and to have a reasoning behind wearing that purple, and to also show survivors and victims of domestic violence in public that you recognize them, you acknowledge them, even if they don't know who you are, you don't know who they are. Obviously, you have no idea who has been through domestic violence or is currently experiencing domestic violence, just taking a look at somebody. So imagine seeing that purple on Purple Thursday or just any time throughout October. And even if somebody wears it unintentionally, it still really does mean a lot. So I hope that if you participated in Purple Thursday, you were able to have a conversation about domestic violence with somebody, or were able to give a survivor or a victim in the public a little bit of acknowledgement and hope. So now it's 2023, and we obviously still have Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So happy Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We hope that this month has been filled with education, acknowledgement, validation, and community. And we hope that you continue to take the spirit of Domestic Violence Awareness Month beyond October, and be vocal about domestic violence during all of the months, and to show up for survivors and victims, not only in your personal lives, but publicly as well when you can. And whether that looks like donating your time to help someone out or help out an organization, it can look like donating your money, donating extra items. There are really so many ways that you can support domestic violence victims, survivors in your community. Just do a simple Google search and look for places around you who serves victims and survivors. And go ahead and take those steps to make sure that you're doing your part in contributing to the bettering of somebody's life who isn't able to have the life that they may want because of somebody else's foul actions and violent intentions. We hear all the time of the stories of victims, survivors of domestic violence, and how they are traumatized and re traumatized over and over again when they have to tell their stories or when they're trying to get resources or any other type of help. And so, as allies, the least we can do is to show up for them and to be vocal about domestic violence, especially because so many survivors and victims aren't able to have a voice themselves. So, of course, there's a responsible way to do this. There's an irresponsible way to do this as well. So just make sure to do your homework. Never speak for somebody, especially when it may be unsafe, and always make sure you're doing what might be best for the victim or survivor instead of thinking what you think is best for them. And if anything, you can always just be a listening ear to somebody. Make sure that they know that you're somebody that is safe that they can talk to. Offer up some of your time, offer up space in your place, anything that is safe for the both of you, and just do your work to make sure that we can create a community, we can create a society, a country safer for domestic violence victims and survivors, no matter what their background is. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Confabulation. Before we wrap up, I just want to make sure all of you know that Holidays is coming up. Holidays is our all inclusive holiday event that our sister's house hosts every single year. And this year it will be taking place in December, the second Saturday, so December 9th, 2023. And it will be starting at 10 a.m. at our sister's house. So look out for more information on our social media. You can find information in our newsletter if you're subscribed to that. And just make sure that you don't miss out on RSVPing for that. And that is going to be required to get into the event. Registration does open next month on November 6th and it ends on November 20. And early registration tickets are limited. So make sure if you want to have those perks that come with early registration to get on that on November 6th at 10:30 a.m. That's when those tickets should be live for early registration. Thank you again for listening to this episode on Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We hope that you took something away from this episode and are able to share it with somebody who might not really understand the purpose of this month or the fact that this month exists at all. We are from Our Sister's House, a domestic violence advocacy and education organization. If you or anyone you know is experiencing domestic violence, you can call our hotline at 253 383 4275 or visit our website at oursistershouse.com. Thank you again and have a good rest of your domestic violence